now I'd like to introduce Mr. Del Janstrom, Architecture Study Team Manager and former Deputy Project Manager for Landsat 8.
Thanks, Dave. Are we doing questions now, or are we doing questions later? As we go? Okay. Hi, everyone. Next slide, please. All right, Dave has already gone through the charge that was given to the architecture study team, so I'm not going to repeat all of that. The only bullet I kind of repeat here is just who we are, and then I'll go into what we've been doing and where we think we're going. We've got a good group of folks from all these various organizations that Dave read through. There's about 14 of us in the core membership on the team. But then we also draw on expertise in various parts of the government and like the Landsat science team and other folks. And we also can draw on other agency level resources for getting our job done as well. As Dave said, we had the kickoff in September, but then we all took an extended holiday, which was really nice, but don't tell Congress that. And so we didn't really start working until late October. And so we've been running to catch up because we have a lot of work to do this year. And so we started doing meetings and telecons and figuring out our methodologies and whatnot. And then finally in the middle of November, so we all got together for an intensive couple of days to work through the finalizing our findings on the RFI responses, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. Establish our initial trade space and set up our plans for what we're doing this fiscal year. When we think about architectures, we might think about, oh, it's just maybe small sats or big sats. Well, actually, selecting an architecture is a very multi-dimensional kind of thing, and we're trying to look at it from all those different angles. We've got folks with expertise in each of these areas on the team, and so we've kind of divided up some of the responsibilities among the team members in these various areas. The first group there, the requirements group, I mean, that's why we're here today. We're looking at user needs and societal impact, how that maps into the specific engineering requirements, and how that drives the remote sensing system design. What's important to note for this is, for this future program, we don't have to make up new requirements, right? Our charge from headquarters is to maintain continuity. And so we are kind of using performance in the ballpark of existing Landsat, especially Landsat 8 satellites, as sort of our benchmark for what we're shooting for. We also have to recognize, though, that we're doing this in a very budget-constrained environment. And so what that means is we may have to make some changes to how Landsat data has been gathered in the past. We may have to do some descopes or rollbacks on performance in order to get inside the cost box. So this requirements group is spending an awful lot of time working on the whys and wherefores behind the requirements, and it folds directly into John Crow's efforts that he's been doing at USGS to make sure we understand that if we do have to change something about how we're gathering this land imagery, we do it in a way that minimizes the negative impacts to the user community. This group of requirements folks is also, though, looking into the future. This program is supposed to run for the next 25 years, and technologies are going to change. We may be able to infuse additional capabilities in an affordable way, and we may want to look at the research community and see if there's anything there that some product that we may need to support more routinely in the future. Through an operational type program. So they're trying to look in the crystal ball as well to see where should we be looking if we have the opportunity to increase performance. So that's what those folks are doing in the imagery requirements or desirement sense. We're also looking at it from an architecture metric sense. What makes for a good architecture versus a bad architecture? How are we going to compare them? They're wrestling with that as well. So the rest of today is all talking about the requirements side of things, desirement side of things. The rest of my talk here is really going to be concentrating on the nuts and bolts of what the AST is doing. So our next couple of groups here get into the technical aspects of an architecture. We've got some folks looking at the instrument and observatory design metrics, looking at specifically the kind of envelope that you might put around different instrument concepts. Envelope meaning in a sense of volume, mass, power, data rate, technology risk, all those things that might drive a cost model or a particular architecture design. We've got some folks working on those, looking specifically at, we're not comparing contractor X's to contractor Y's designs. We're not doing that at all. What we're trying to do is look at the architecture trade space, find out where the breakpoints are in the architecture trade space. What does that mean in terms of instrument envelope, and what kinds of performance you can expect from an instrument in that kind of envelope. And so we've got a set of folks that are working through the various kinds of instruments that might fly. And that kind of drives everything else. We're looking at enabling technologies in the future. Again, we have to look at the next 25 years and how technologies might change the picture of what you can do within a given envelope. Then that all maps into the spacecraft and spacecraft design drivers, and then all of that ultimately goes into what your launch options are. So those folks are all wrestling with all those technical hardware kinds of aspects of what might fly. Then you have the architecture technical concepts. That's the orbits, the fields of view, the revisit rates, the number of observatories up there at any given time, communications architectures, ground system development, all of that, mission operations. Those two groups there's actually a lot of overlap of who's doing what in there. They're kind of merging into one. And then we've got the whole business model side. The business models drive cost as much as anything else does, maybe even more. And so we've got various options set aside for different procurement methods, commercialization, data buys, block buys, hosted payloads, international participation. So we're trying to look at all of those different areas. Each of those areas we've established a trade space in each of those areas, and then as we define different points in the trade space as being potentially viable architectures or viable approaches, we then go into architecture gap analysis and cost assessment. We're doing, setting up parametric and analogy methods for doing some initial costing and cost phasing, and then looking at also the gap analysis, meaning what's the risk of having a coverage gap, the robustness that Dave was talking about. We don't want a fragile system. So not only what's the risk of a gap, but what's the chances we might have more than one asset up there at any given time in order to improve revisit rate. And being a very cost-constrained environment, we may not be able to launch as often as we'd like. And so the cost assessment and cost phasing may wind up often driving your launch rate, which will then drive your gap analysis. So that's how we've divided up the problem. Next slide, please. So what are we doing with that? Well, first, like I said, we are establishing a trade space, and the RFI responses certainly played a role in helping us make sure that our trade spaces are complete. That as good ideas came in through those RFIs, we made sure that they were captured into the various aspects that I just went through. And then we're going through this trade space through a series of design cycles or analysis cycles, or whatever you want to call it. We're looking at the candidate architectures, and even just by looking at this taxonomy of various architectures, there's certain areas that you kind of go, I think that's a smart area to investigate first, or if we investigate this one and this one, it will be particularly informative. So we're doing that and sort of picking what subset of the trade space we want to first investigate. We make sure we develop those satellite and system technical parameters and business models that I just went through for those runs. And then we go through the gap analysis and life cycle cost analysis on that. And then we sit back and we say, okay, what did we learn by that? And that will then guide the next round of digging through this trade space, trying to make sense of it. The idea is to get through several design cycles in the next 3 months, and hopefully greatly narrow this trade space. Right now we have sort of a wide open trade space, and so we're trying to narrow this trade space down to just hopefully a few viable options. And then as we find appealing architectures, well, then we'll set those aside and they will go through some additional analysis. We have to make sure that certainly the agencies agree and will stand behind our cost estimates and that kind of thing. So we're working with headquarters assets to make sure that we're doing everything we need to do to get buy-in from all levels of the agencies. Next slide, please. Let's talk a little bit about the RFI responses. As Dave said, we had 35 responses. Thank you very much to everyone who participated in that. They were very helpful. Many of them were very thoughtfully done. Folks have put a lot of thought into this, and they're very helpful. That showed that our thinking was pretty much in keeping with industry's thinking on the various ways that we can carry this mission out. And so what did we do with those responses? It seeded our trade space. Like I said, we're not comparing vendor X's to vendor Y's approach. Your ideas, everything, when we said, ooh, that's a good idea, we made sure it was captured in our trade space, and we're going to investigate those various approaches. Next slide, please. Here's sort of a characterization of the responses that came in. There was a wide-ranging set of responses. About a handful of them were what we might call a complete system architectures. That's all the way from the physical architectures of the spacecraft and how they might change over time, to business models, to operations, to the whole deal. There were several folks who talked about maintaining sort of single satellite approaches like Landsat has been. Quite a few folks were talking about small sat, multi-sat architectures. There were some ideas on hosted payloads, quite a number of instrument concepts, several ground system and data processing architectures and ideas. International collaboration, there were a few of those. Quite a number had business models talking about recommended procurement methods, and then some talking about shared launch opportunities. Then we had a smattering of other things. Quite a number of folks responded with some technology ideas and servicing ideas and a few other things. Next slide, please. So, opportunities for industry participation in the near future. As I said, first off, thank you very much to everyone who did participate in the RFI. It was very helpful. We may wind up going back to a few folks for some clarifying questions if there were particular things that we either didn't understand or felt we need a little more information on. We may go back to some individual responders with some specific clarifications. But at this point, we do not plan any general discussions with industry or paid studies. We looked carefully at our opportunities for doing paid studies at this point in time. And first off, we have issues with the competitive process takes time. And the opportunity for getting through a competitive process, making a selection, having time for industry to do something of value and get the results in before we have to supply our responses to headquarters is very difficult. And we're also at this point, we have a wide open trade space. We can't issue, say, 30-some competitive studies. We would drown in trying to put that together. But neither are we in a position to narrow down and only make 4, 6, or 8 awards because we have no criteria on which to make that kind of selection. So at this point, we have a wealth of information to work on. We're an educated customer, and with your RFI response information and the ideas that the government has been wrestling with internally for several years. And NASA has been looking at, gee, if we could relax this requirement or that requirement, how might we be able to shrink these instruments or make them cheaper? We've also been looking at how could we improve performance. And so we have our own, excuse me, we have our own set of ideas of how we might be able to improve performance or reduce cost as well. So we have all of that, plus your industry ideas. And so at this point, we think we can credibly and meaningfully explore the trade space, establish sort of a level playing field, and narrow the trade space before we come back to industry for some additional help. And so, as Dave said, we're planning an industry forum in the March timeframe, where by then we should be able to come to you and say, here's the work we've done. Here's how we've been able to narrow the trade space. We think the sweet spots are here or here or here. And we will come back soliciting specific feedback on those ideas and probably some help on specific questions. And then hopefully also at that time, we'll have a much better idea of how industry can participate from then on, whether it's through paid methods or whatever. Right now we can't, I don't know how likely it is at this point that any one approach is going to be a clear winner, or are we going to have 2 or 3 or 4 different approaches that are all viable. That those kinds of findings would drive what we would do with procurements and whatnot. So we just have to let this play out for a few months. We have a good team of people working very hard on it. Next slide, please. So our plan forward, as I said, we've established our candidate architecture set. We're narrowing it down as we go through it for what we're going to run during this first design cycle. We're fleshing out the technical parameters for those initial runs, and we plan to hopefully run 3 design cycles by the March timeframe, basically one per month as we get things going. And each run will wind up with, time phase cost profiles, our robustness kind of assessment, and technical assessments of pros and cons, how well it addresses requirements and whatnot. Excuse me. And then May is ultimately our deadline for having all of this work done. So by the March timeframe, we're going to come back and ask for some help from the community, and then we've got April to absorb that and finalize our recommendations to the headquarters. So I think that's all my slides. We taking questions now?
One point of clarification, I think Dave mentioned a community forum in March, and you talked about industry forum. Is it the same thing, or one with the user community and one with industry?
No, the one I'm talking about is industry, but I think it's the same. Right.
Hi, Bob Leroy with Lockheed Martin. What do you see as your goal in that March timeframe? Actually putting out some other RFI requests based on what you've learned in the upcoming 3 months?
Whether it would be an RFI or whether it would be through the forum itself and posting some specific questions on the website, at that point, I think there simply would not be time to run any kind of procurement cycles and still affect the results. It will have to be through RFI-like or gratis kinds of participation. I don't know how else we can do it.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, John Petherill, Lockheed Martin. When you say you're comparing candidate architectures, are you talking about near-term architecture and a 2B architecture at some point in the future? Or are you comparing architectures as a snapshot in time, or what?
Well, the time phasing of it is all part of it as well. We're doing a detailed reliability analysis of the on-orbit assets, and also looking at Sentinel as well, trying to get as much information as we can to look at reliability there. And that will contribute to how long current assets might last, what does it mean in terms of risk of getting a new system up there, what aspects of the measurements, like thermal, for instance, what aspects are most at risk. And so we're looking at the time phasing of how a new architecture could be infused. And so part of the trade space is, do we shoot for a near-term solution while we're working on a longer-term solution, or do we go straight to a longer-term solution? That's all in the trade space right now.
Thank you.
Sorry, Dave, can't say anything.
The goal or the objective we gave to the architecture study team is to come up with an integrated architecture for the whole time frame, not a separate short-term solution, a separate long-term solution, but an integrated set that's a complete architecture. And they're to come up. We will recommend one going forward in August, but they've been charged with coming up with several to evaluate and to bring forward to us at NASA headquarters and USGS to evaluate.